Picture this, you're talking to a woman in her 30s. She's intelligent, educated, successful. She wants a relationship. She says all the right things about commitment and partnership. And then you watch her behavior. Constant phone checking, validation seeking, attention fragmented across dozen apps, unable to be present for 10 minutes, contradicting what she says she wants with everything she does. And you think she's just distracted or conflicted or playing games. But here's what you don't understand: her brain isn't the same brain her mother had. It's been physically rewired. The neural pathways altered, the chemical systems reprogrammed, the structural architecture modified. This isn't metaphor. This isn't exaggeration. This is documented neuroscience. The female brain post-2010 has undergone neuroplastic changes unprecedented in human history, and she doesn't even know it happened. What if I told you that the reason modern women behave so differently from previous generations isn't cultural shift or feminist ideology or generational values, but actual physical rewiring of brain structure and function? What if I told you that social media, smartphones, and digital technology have literally altered the neurological pathways in the female brain, modified dopamine response systems, fragmented attention regulation mechanisms, and rewired social bonding circuits in ways that make traditional relationship formation neurologically difficult, if not impossible? What if I told you that the woman sitting across from you has a fundamentally different brain than the woman sitting across from a man in 2005? Not different beliefs, different neural architecture, and that architecture makes her behave in ways she can't and fully control, because the control systems themselves have been rewired? This is happening to an entire generation right now. Women born after 1990, raised with smartphones from teenage years, spending critical neural development periods with Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok. Their brains adapted to digital environments during the exact window when neuroplasticity is highest, when brain structures are most malleable, when environmental inputs literally shape physical brain architecture. And the inputs were unprecedented. Constant notifications, infinite social comparison, algorithmic validation, dopamine hits engineered by tech companies optimizing for addiction. And female brains, more neuroplastic than male brains during social development, more sensitive to social reward, more responsive to peer feedback, underwent adaptation, massive structural and functional rewiring to handle digital environment. And that rewiring changed everything about how they process relationships, attention, emotion, satisfaction. And she has no idea, because it felt natural. It felt like growing up, but it was brain modification. And now she is trapped in neural architecture designed for digital world, trying to function in relationship context that requires pre-digital brain systems. Before I reveal the 5 brain systems that have been physically rewired in modern women, and why this makes traditional relationships neurologically incompatible with their modified architecture, drop a comment right now if you've then noticed women your age behave completely differently from women just 10 years older. I need to know how universal this observation is. Now watch closely, because what I am about to show you will change how you understand modern female behavior forever. I've watched human brains evolve across millennia, watched neural adaptations to agriculture, to cities, to written language, but I've never seen anything like this. Never seen an entire generation's brains rewire themselves in 15 years. The speed is unprecedented. The scale is global. The impact is catastrophic for relationship formation, because brains evolved over hundreds of thousands of years for face-to-face social interaction, for limited social groups, for delayed gratification, for sustained attention. And then suddenly in 2010 forward, those same brains got exposed to infinite social feeds, constant notifications, instant validation, algorithmic manipulation, and they did what brains do. They adapted. Neuroplasticity kicked in, and the adaptation optimized for digital environment, not relationship environment. And now you're trying to form relationships with brains optimized for completely different context. But here's what you need to understand before I reveal the rewiring. This isn't her fault. She didn't choose this. Neuroplasticity is automatic. Brains physically restructure themselves in response to environmental inputs, whether you want them to or not. You can't consent to neuroplasticity. You can't opt out. If you spend 5 hours daily on Instagram during ages 13 to 25, your brain will rewire itself to handle that environment. Guaranteed, not maybe, guaranteed. And the rewiring will be physical, measurable on brain scans, dopamine receptor density changes. Prefrontal cortex activation patterns shift. Attention network connectivity modifies. This is biology, not choice. And she experienced this during critical development window. So her brain architecture is fundamentally different. And that difference explains everything about her behavior that confuses you. Here's the first brain system that has been physically rewired. System 1. Dopamine reward pathways. In pre-digital female brains, dopamine reward came from sustained relationship investment, from deep conversation, from emotional intimacy, from long-term pair bonding. The neural pathways reinforced these behaviors because they triggered dopamine release, which felt good, which made brain repeat behaviors. But digital environment changed this completely. Now dopamine comes from likes, from comments, from followers, from notifications, from infinite stream of micro-validations. And here's the critical part. These digital dopamine hits come faster, more frequently, more predictably than relationship dopamine. So the brain's reward pathways rewired themselves. The neural circuits that used to fire for relationship depth now fire for social media validation. The dopamine receptors that used to respond to intimate connection now respond to Instagram hearts. This is measurable physical change. The pathways literally changed structure. Think about what this means for her behavior. She's in conversation with you, face-to-face, real human connection. But her brain, as reward system, isn't firing because this interaction doesn't trigger the dopamine pathways that have been rewired for digital validation. So she feels bored, unstimulated, like something's missing, and she checks her phone, gets notifications, dopamine fires, feels good, and her brain reinforces phone checking, not conversation depth. She's not choosing to be rude. Her reward pathways have been physically altered to prioritize digital over analog validation. The neural architecture makes sustained face-to-face interaction feel unrewarding compared to phone. And she can't override this easily because overriding requires prefrontal control, but that system is also rewired. I've watched reward systems drive human behavior across history, watched what humans optimize for: food, sex, status, connection. But always the reward systems were calibrated for real-world inputs, for things that actually existed in environment. But digital created something new. Reward systems calibrated for infinite artificial validation. And female brains, more socially oriented, more reward-sensitive in social domains, underwent more dramatic recalibration. Their dopamine pathways became tuned to metrics that don't exist in physical reality. Likes, follows, views. And now those pathways are firing constantly for digital inputs and barely firing for relationship inputs. And she wonders why real connection feels empty, why physical presence feels boring. Not understanding her brain's reward system has been rewired to find digital more rewarding than real. But the reward rewiring is just the beginning. System 2. Attention regulation circuits. Pre-digital female brains could sustain attention on single tasks, conversations, experiences. The prefrontal cortex maintained focus, filtered distractions, regulated attention shifts. But digital environment is designed to fragment attention. Infinite scroll, autoplay, notifications. Every app engineered to capture and fracture attention into smaller and smaller units. And female brains exposed to this during development adapted. The attention regulation circuits rewired themselves. The neural networks responsible for sustained focus physically changed their connectivity patterns. The default mode became fragmented attention, rapid task switching, continuous partial attention. And this shows up on brain scans. Measurable differences in attention network activity between pre-digital and post-digital female brains. Watch how this manifests in her behavior. You're telling her something important, emotionally vulnerable, and she's listening, but also her attention is splitting. Part of her brain is tracking phone notifications. Part is planning social media posts. Part is running background anxiety about missing something online. She's not choosing divided attention. Her brain's attention regulation system has been rewired to operate in fragmented mode as default. Sustained single-focus attention feels abnormal, uncomfortable, like she's missing out. Because the neural circuits have adapted to expect constant input switching, and when that switching doesn't happen, the brain sends anxiety signals, creates discomfort, pushes her to fracture attention, and she does. And you interpret it as she doesn't care. But her attention circuits have been physically altered to make sustained focus neurologically difficult. I've watched attention spans change across centuries, watched written language extend them, watched television shorten them, but I've never seen attention systems rewire themselves this quickly. The modern female brain's attention networks are structurally different. The connectivity patterns between prefrontal cortex and posterior attention systems have changed. The brain operates in continuous scanning mode, not sustained focus mode. And this makes deep conversation neurologically exhausting for her, not because she's shallow, but because her brain's attention architecture has been optimized for rapid switching, not sustained engagement. And fighting against your own neural architecture is cognitively draining, so she doesn't fight it. She lets attention fragment, and connection depth suffers, because connection depth requires sustained attention, and her brain can't sustain anymore. And the rewiring goes deeper. System 3. Social bonding mechanisms. Human brains form bonds through oxytocin release during face-to-face interaction, eye contact, physical touch, shared experience. These triggered neurochemical bonding that created attachment. But digital sociality changed the inputs. Now social interaction happens through screens, parasocial relationships with influencers, thousands of shallow connections instead of few deep ones, and the bonding mechanisms adapted. The neural circuits responsible for pair bonding, for deep attachment formation, rewired themselves for shallow broad networks instead of deep narrow bonds. This is measurable in brain connectivity. The patterns that used to activate for intimate bonding now activate for broad network maintenance. Think about what this does to relationship formation. She meets you, you connect, but her brain's bonding mechanisms are calibrated for managing hundreds of social connections, simultaneously not deepening one bond intensely. So the neural pathways that should be strengthening your specific connection are instead distributing attention across her entire social network. She's bonding with you, but also maintaining bonds with 200 Instagram friends, 50 Snapchat, streaks 3 dating apps worth of potential connections, and her brain's bonding capacity gets distributed across this network so thinly that no single bond ever reaches depth. Threshold. She feels connected to everyone superficially, but no one deeply. And she doesn't understand why, thinks maybe she hasn't met right person, not realizing her bonding mechanisms have been rewired to optimize for breadth, not depth. I've watched human bonding systems for millennia, watched tribes bond deeply with 30 people, watched villages bond with hundreds, but always there was depth with inner circle. Closest bonds were strongest bonds. But digital rewired this. Modern female brains bond broadly with everyone weakly. The neural mechanism that used to create deep attachment to specific person now creates diffuse attachment to network. And she's looking for deep bond, wants deep bond, but her brain's bonding architecture can't create it anymore because the circuits have been repurposed. And relationship after relationship fails because depth never forms. Not because she is incapable of love, but because her brain's love-forming mechanisms have been physically altered to operate in different mode. But here's where the rewiring becomes truly devastating for relationships. System 4. Emotional regulation systems. Pre-digital female brains regulated emotion through internal mechanisms. Prefrontal cortex modulated emotional responses, managed distress, maintained baseline. But digital environment externalized emotion regulation. Feeling bad, post for validation. Feeling anxious, scroll for distraction. Feeling lonely, check likes. The brain learned to regulate emotion through external digital inputs instead of internal mechanisms. And the neural pathways rewired. The circuits that used to handle internal emotional regulation atrophied from disuse, while new circuits formed connecting emotional states to digital regulation strategies. Watch what this creates. She feels emotional discomfort, which is normal in relationships, conflict, uncertainty, vulnerability, and her brain automatically reaches for phone to regulate, to externalize the emotional management. But this prevents development of internal regulation capacity, prevents learning to sit with discomfort, to process emotion internally, to regulate through self rather than screen. And over years, the internal regulation systems weaken from disuse, while dependency on external digital regulation strengthens. And now she's in a relationship that requires internal emotional regulation, requires sitting with uncomfortable feelings, processing them, working through them, but her brain's regulation systems have been rewired to outsource that to digital, so she can't. Relationship difficulty triggers emotional discomfort, and instead of regulating internally, she reaches for phone scrolls, distracts, avoids, and relationship problems never get processed. Because processing requires internal regulation capacity her brain no longer has. I've watched humans develop emotional regulation across development. Watched children learn to manage feeling, watched adults master emotional complexity. But always it required practicing internal regulation, building those neural pathways through use. But digital generation never built them, never practiced, outsourced regulation to screens during exact developmental window when those pathways should have been forming. And now they're adults with underdeveloped internal regulation systems and overdeveloped external digital regulation dependencies. And relationships require internal regulation, require emotional resilience, require capacity to sit with discomfort, and her brain can't. The neural architecture isn't there. It was never built because environment never required it. And now she's facing relationship challenges with emotional regulation system designed for digital avoidance, not relational processing. And here's the final system that explains relationship impossibility. System 5. Decision-making networks. Pre-digital female brains made decisions through weighing options, considering long-term consequences, committing to choices. A prefrontal decision circuits evaluated, selected, committed, but digital environment created infinite optionality, infinite choices, constant comparison, and the decision networks rewired themselves. The neural pathways that used to support commitment and closure now support continuous option, evaluation, and perpetual comparison. This shows in brain imaging. The decision-making networks in modern female brains show different activation patterns, less commitment finality, more ongoing evaluation. The circuits have been optimized for keeping options open, not closing decisions.